Please welcome to the stage David Keith and Ed Whittingham.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special live taping of the Energy versus Climate podcast. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by one of my co-hosts today, David Keith. We're missing our third co-host, Sarah Hastings-Simon, who will be back joining us very soon, we hope. Now, David and I, we've spent a good chunk of our careers working on the climate problem, and we're happy that the world has made a lot of progress. 1.7% of global economic output is now being spent on clean energy. That's the good news, and global emissions may even peak in this decade. The bad news is that resistance to the increasing cost of decarbonization is also increasing. It's on the rise. Public concern around climate as an issue is lower than it's been in the past. The latest Abacus data poll has it at number 6 on issues of importance to Canadian. And 2030 emissions cuts are likely to fall well short of stated pledges. So that's the bad news. And meanwhile, global average temperatures continue to increase. The World Meteorological Association reported in March of this year that 2023 was the hottest year on record, with a global average surface temperature near 1.45 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. And that was the warmest 10-year period. Now let's pivot. The terms climate engineering, solar geoengineering, and solar radiation management all refer to a set of approaches designed to cool the planet or stop the planet from warming. And given that progress to cut emissions may not be as fast as we had hoped, there's now an increasing amount of interest and attention being paid to these approaches. Yet, of course, the thought of purposely injecting, say, aerosols into the stratosphere as a means to cool the planet is not without controversy, and that's probably understating it. As many people in this room know, David Keith, my friend and podcast co-host, is one of the world's foremost researchers in the field. So today we thought at Unite 2024 would take advantage of his expertise to talk about solar geoengineering specifically and bring that to Unite and bring that to Calgary, because I don't think it's a topic that is really discussed much here at all. Now, it seems a bit weird to introduce my co-host, but let me just say the brief points. David is a professor of geophysical sciences at the University of Chicago. He's also the founding faculty director of the Climate Engineering Initiative at University of Chicago, and previously he taught at Harvard, at the University of Calgary here in Alberta, and Carnegie Mellon University. So, as weird as it, welcome David Keith.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here. Watching the signs for Energy Disruptors, it says Disruptors Unite, and the sign behind me, and it feels like there's some kind of oxymoronic vibe there.
I wondered about that. Yeah.
What should they want this audience to do, disrupt or unite?
Yeah, it's like the meeting for the anarchists. The anarchists are all going to meet at 4 o'clock.
Exactly.
Don't be late.
Yeah.
So, David and I were going to have a discussion about solar geoengineering, the technical, the non-technical bits, and then we're going to turn to the audience for questions. We're going to save the last 10 to 15 minutes for audience Q&A. And just a note for everyone that this is being recorded for posterity, that this will drop on the Energy versus Climate field of
pod.
Yes, pod, not field. So anything you say will be saved for all time immemorial. Now, I just want to say off the top, so I ran an NGO, the Pembina Institute, and as an executive director with David, we helped to convene the first meeting on solar geoengineering in Canada that we knew of, serious one, involving government and NGOs in its day. I'm supportive of research into it, and when I listen to you and others in the field, specifically around stratospheric aerosol injection, I think the technical and economic barriers are surmountable, but that the real challenges lay in the non-technical aspects, which we'll get to. Those are the most prickly ones. But let's start at the beginning. What is solar geoengineering?
So I define it only in terms of the other things we can do about climate. So from the way I think about it, there's really 4 fundamental categories of things humans can do to manage climate risk. Decarbonize the economy, cut emissions, remove carbon from the atmosphere, alter the energy balance of the Earth to reduce some of the consequences of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, or adaptation. And I think none of those can really be lumped with another. Of course, there's lots of individual technologies inside and lots of political pathways to get there. I'm not saying we need to do all those things, but I think we need to think in 4 dimensions. I think you can't throw any of those out of the pie forever. I think there aren't really any other. Those are the 4 categories of ways humans can manage climate risk. And I think one way that, I don't think you should lump them together too much, but one thing that unites carbon removal and solar geoengineering is they both deal with the consequences of CO2 emissions that are in the atmosphere. What cutting emissions does, which we have to do, what cutting emissions does is it avoids us putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. But as of course, I assume all of you know, even if we cut emissions to 0 tomorrow, we don't stop, well, we stop it warming up further, but we don't deal with the warming there is. In that sense, it's important to realize how different climate change is from a lot of environmental problems we might be used to. So air pollution is still a much bigger killer in the world than climate, but air pollutants last in the atmosphere for a few days. So if you really did regulate out all the air pollutants, then the impacts on human health basically go away almost instantly, or the direct impacts. Climate is just not like that. If we eliminate emissions tomorrow, climate doesn't get any better, and indeed some aspects like sea level rise would keep getting worse. And so if you want to deal with historical emissions, if you want global temperatures to go down at any point, you have to consider either carbon removal or solar geoengineering or some combination.
So that's what you mean, because you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and I think you published it last year, and you said that there are only 2 ways to cool the planet in this century. One is through carbon removal, and the other would be through another climate engineering thing, like stratospheric aerosol injection or solar geo.
Exactly. So cutting emissions doesn't cool the planet. Cutting emissions stops you warming the planet. Cutting emissions makes the planet warm more slowly than otherwise would have, but at no point will cutting emissions actually bring temperatures down. To bring temperatures down, you have to do either carbon removal or solar geo.
Yeah, so I just want to hammer that point home because I think it's a really important one. We might be successful in getting to net zero in our lifetimes. It might be we're successful by 2050, which is sort of the rough global target, but that, what you're saying, may just crystallize a level of warming that is dangerous, where a lot of bad things happen, and just getting to net zero doesn't bring that temperature down.
Correct. I want to inject my view about 2050. I personally think the chance of getting to net zero by 2050 is really low, and I'm not sure it's meaningfully a global target. I agree it's something that some governments say, but there's dynamics in politics where, as we all understand, governments have reasons to say things for some constituents that they don't mean. If you measure by actual actions, if you look at the flow of actions and rules on the ground, I don't think the world is on target for net zero by 2050, and I'm not actually sure net zero by 2050 would be an ethically sound choice at this point, because there are real trade-offs. There are, still 700 million people without access to electricity. There are complicated trade-offs. I think getting net zero around 2070 feels a lot more believable and kind of like a reasonable choice to me.
Yeah, and just on the global disparity.
Yeah.
For us, if I turn on a 40-watt bulb in my house and leave it on for an hour, it costs me less than half a cent. 860 people still lack access to reliable access to electricity. And generally, you want to charge a phone. It costs something similar to that. It costs half a cent. Then in many places, you're walking down, going to a store, and you're paying 25 cents or 200 times what we pay. So there's great disparity, and thank you for bringing that up. But let's now talk about the technical dimensions of solar geoengineering, or specifically within that stream, stratospheric aerosol injection. So you're talking about putting sulfates into the stratosphere as a way of, sort of, to put it crudely, as sort of refracting sunlight, or how do you do that in a way, when you do that, is it on a hemispheric basis? You put it up into the atmosphere and it goes across the hemisphere? Can you do it in a localized way? Like, how does that work?
So very quickly, there are a bunch of different ways that theoretically you could do solar geoengineering, from huge space shields to marine cloud brightening, but the only way that is technically a development project, that without any research you actually understand how you could do it, is to put sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. And there's a way in which, in a kind of brutal way, there's no question you could go and build the hardware to do that now. And what you would do is put sulfuric acid precursor gases, SO2 or H2S or something, in the atmosphere at somewhere between maybe 15 to 20 kilometers altitude, depending on the latitude. And yes, it doesn't stay in one place. It naturally wants to mix, at least on a hemispheric basis. And so a key thing we say is that if one wanted to do this, I think in a way that was beneficial broadly to humanity from what we now know, you'd want to do it in a way that was hemispherically balanced. You want to do about the same amount across the hemispheres so you don't shift the intertropical convergence zone, the area of heavy rainfall and dry land.
Mm-hmm. So can you speak quickly, and you want that radiative forcing to be roughly even, and if it's uneven, are then you shifting the climate benefits versus climate disbenefits equation? Like, for instance, is there a way that you could do this, and obviously unintentionally, where you've got localized benefits over here, let's say the Western Hemisphere, but then in the Eastern Hemisphere, then you've got disbenefits, and so one side of the world is winning and one side of the world is losing?
Western and Eastern, the answer is a clear no. Atmosphere flows around with the jet stream and the circulation going the other way.
Yeah.
Atmosphere flows east to west pretty quickly. So there's no version of this allows you to do east versus west. But north versus south is more isolated. And the two hemispheres are really quite isolated, northern versus southern.
Yeah.
So it is possible, technically, to do it in just one hemisphere and not the other.
Yeah. Sorry, did we just lose David's audio?
So I think we still got it.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, then just also on the technical side, well, let's talk a little bit about the state of research and the knowns versus the unknowns. So what do we know now based on, maybe you could start, like, what is the total spend on research going into solar geoengineering relative to other forms of climate mitigation? And then roughly, what do we know now and what are the big unknowns?
So I think that's a crucial question. A crucial question is, should you folks, should decision makers and citizens trust anything that I or other people like me are saying? And I think in thinking about that, you need to think what makes you trust or not trust different areas of science. And I don't have a magic answer, but I think general rules are I trust science more if it's been going on for a long time, if it's pretty global, that it's not just all in one place, and if there isn't a big commercial interest. Those are kind of thactors that lead me to trust. So if there's some like amazing thing that maybe got published in Nature that shows how some totally new drug can cure cancer, but it was just published last year and the people have patents on it, I'm excited that it got into Nature, but I'm not going to believe it that much. But things that have been around for a very long time, like our knowledge of climate science, that are very distributed over both over time and space, and where there's not big commercial interests, I have a lot of faith in. And so I think in thinking about solar geoengineering, on the one hand, the total research spend is $50 million a year, $30 million a year. It's hard to measure. It's that kind of number. It depends on whether you're measuring explicit money or people in government science labs working on it, even though they don't have a grant, but of that order. And there's 1,000 papers that have been published, but maybe the median age of those papers is just sort of 5 years or 8 years. So a lot have happened new. So if I just tell you that, and much of the papers are dominated by a small group of people, whom I'm one. So with all those factors, I think you should say this isn't very trustworthy. But I think it actually is trustworthy, and the reason it's trustworthy is that this really is not rightly thought about as a new piece of science and technology. It's really just applying stuff that we know from atmospheric and environmental science, and some of it we've known for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So to get a little nerdy for you, but I think it really matters in kind of you forming opinions about whether you should trust any of this. So I can tell you that all climate models, when you actually put in hemispherically balanced, moderate solar geoengineering, they show amazing results, every single model. They show that any variable that are the big variables we care about, extreme temperatures, extreme precipitations, water availability, we see that those are pushed back towards the pre-industrial, that changes are reduced essentially everywhere. But again, you might think, why would you believe it? Here's one little factoid that you might think about. The first review article on stratospheric sulfates was published in 1961. It's a very old thing. And because sulfur is such an environmental killer, we have an enormous number of papers studying sulfur in the atmosphere going back literally to the 1880s. I mean, the first power plant with a sulfur scrubber was upstream of London in the 1880s or 90s. I mean, this is not a new thing. So it's that deep body of science that means that I think in many ways the uncertainties are not as big as we used to portray them.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to the trustworthiness question, because it's a very interesting one, roughly how many researchers would you say today are working globally on solar geoengineering?
it's really hard to measure. If you're talking people who are working full-time on it, I don't know, hundreds. But if you're talking people who touch it, it's much larger, because almost any climate center now has somebody thinking about it. It's changing very fast.
Yeah.
And there's probably big chunk of new, both government money and private money, philanthropic money coming in this year. There's also, some of you may not know, there's some kind of high-level assessment. So the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, published a very short, readable summary called One Atmosphere last year that made a very clear and I think pretty positive story about how this could be useful, also how it is definitely risky. There's also, in a kind of global sense, this isn't just run by any, again, don't trust it's run by UChicago, right? Don't trust if it's run by any one thing. There's the World Meteorological Organization, which is maybe one of the very oldest international orgs of any kind, way predates the UN. It has a thing called the World Climate Research Program, which is very international, and even through the Cold War, that was international research. That thing has a limited number of so-called lighthouse programs that push on new areas of research, and there's now a major one on climate engineering. And that, again, none of that I just mentioned, that and the UNEP report, that shows the way this is all much more kind of real than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, and as I said off the top, I, for one, am supportive of expanded research into solar geoengineering, climate engineering generally, and as a way of trying to increase that scientific base of knowledge and increase the number of researchers too, so that it's less susceptible to groupthink.
Yep.
And that groupthink, I assume, can creep into those climate models too.
For sure. And so to me, I've actually been pushing kind of internal to the solar geo community, saying that we're kind of getting bored of just running the same model experiment. I don't think we're learning much. I think the community has to be more serious about looking about what the high consequence, low probability kind of tails of the distribution are. A lot of the papers you see published on solar geo are saying, oh, this other result was wrong by 30%. But if it's 30% all about finding ways that we dramatically reduce climate risks, those of you out there won't really care. The big question is it wrong? Is there some giant thing we're missing? Is there some gotcha that means you do this and you don't get what we expect? And I think we need a much better effort to look for those gotchas. And I personally, I'll say this, I wouldn't vote to really begin deployment until, I don't think we actually need a lot in the way of new science. We need a much more critical look at the science we have with teams of scientists whose job it is to find problems.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I trust you personally. I've been climbing with you. You've been rappelling me. I trusted you. I didn't fall off the wall. I even squeezed into your tiny little climbing shoes when we did that. But so let's talk about this strange notion of fighting pollution with pollution. So as you say, you talked about sulfuric acid, and it's been well documented from industrial plants like coal plants. It creates respiratory illness. It kills people. So we're talking about intentionally adding, say, sulfuric acid or sulfates into the stratosphere. So then there's got to be a good cost-benefit ratio to that.
That's right.
And what do we know about that cost-benefit ratio?
I think the answer is we increasingly know a lot. So for putting sulfur in the stratosphere, again, we have this giant body of research about the impacts of sulfur aerosols on human health. So we can actually calculate that if you put, say, this kind of 1.5 million tons a year of sulfur in the atmosphere, which would cool the Earth some little more than 0.5 degrees C, you can calculate what the direct health impacts would be, and that is what the added mortality burden would be, and it's about 7,000 a year with quite wide error bars, but that's the kind of number we're talking about for that amount. That's for 1 degree C of cooling. And that's no joke, that's actual 7,000 added sulfur mortality. Of course, the total sulfur mortality now is more like 5 million. But then what you want to do is compare that to how much mortality will be reduced by the cooling effect. And so we now have really quite good epidemiology that shows what the impacts of cooling the world are, and it's the flip side of what the impacts of heating the world are in terms of people dying from heat stress. And so using really the kind of state-of-the-art of these epidemiological models, we're now able to compare those two things. And again, me and some people are comparing them, but it's not like we've done all the work underneath. It's work done underneath this by huge groups of people. And that comparison shows that for 1 degree C of cooling late this century, you'd have this sort of 7,000-ish with big error bars added deaths from sulfur air pollution, and 1,000 or 2,000 added deaths from the effect of ozone depletion. Those are not jokes. And then you'd have something like 500,000 reduction in deaths from heat. And so that ratio is more than 10 to 1. Mm-hmm. And the reduction in deaths from heat is heavily concentrated in the poor and developing parts of the world who need it the most. And that, to me, is the ethical case, not necessarily for doing this, but for taking it seriously.
Yep. I said off the top, from what I understand, and we're getting to it, that the technical challenges and the economic challenges are surmountable, the governance and decision-making challenges are very prickly. So we talked about the technical challenges. Let's just talk very quickly about economics. If you're to put 1.5 million tons per year of sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, what's the rough order of cost?
A few $1 billion, certainly under $10 billion a year. So the costs are basically zero compared to the other costs. I mean, the cost of climate damages, the monetized cost of climate damages, mid or late century are well over $1 trillion a year, well over 1% of GDP. And the costs of decarbonization are also well over $1 trillion a year. So something that's less than 10 billion is, I think the big lesson here is that cost is not the issue. The issue is about trust and power and decision-making, how confident different groups of humans are this is really a good idea or not, what they do, but it's not really about the cost of doing it.
Yeah, the cost is on the order of the food and beverage bill for Unite 2024. It's,
no, well,
cheap. Thank you for the hot chocolate, by the way.
I don't think we're getting our share. I've just got water here.
Can I get a stage runner for hot chocolate, please? Stage runner for hot chocolate.
Bring it up,
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get to those non-technical dimensions, the prickly bits. So first off, you'd mentioned before, like cooling the planet by a degree. So how do we agree on an objective? Are we actually cooling the planet? Are we stopping the planet from warming? So a little bit on like, what's the objective and how do you get consensus on that objective?
So big news flash, which I expect you know, I expect you all know, humans don't get consensus on anything. And that's just not the way we roll as a species. I'm not sure I would want to live in a species that did everything by consensus, but in any case, hominids, this hominid class does not.
Yeah.
And I think there's ways in which we've done things better or worse as a society. Obviously, global governance feels a lot less good now than it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But there's also ways in which humans have collaborated pretty imperfectly on not having nuclear wars or not destroying the ozone layer or global diseases in ways that are surprisingly effective despite having no consensus. And I think consensus is not the right thing to hope for. I think what you can hope for is a reasonably stable political outcome that actually provides a good outcome for most people, and not just humans. I also think humans aren't the only entities that matter here. I care about the natural world other than humans. But I think consensus is really, to be blunt, a kind of absurd thing to talk about. I think what we need to do is some way talk about a middle ground. It's common in conversations about this, just sort of some people say, we can't do solar geoengineering because we'll never get global agreement about it. But of course, we never got global agreement about the internet or mRNA vaccines, which could also be weaponized, or
AI being released to the internet.
And another point of view is it'll all be done by one billionaire rogue who just does it. And I think there's also deep reasons why that's not the way it's going to happen. I think in practice, if it happens with a small coalition of countries, and you get to start to think about what that coalition is, what holds it together, who the opponents are. That's the kind of reality of how this happens.
Yeah. So it's similar to unintended consequences, I say consensus. The unintended consequences, we can say there will certainly be unintended consequences were you to start doing this. For sure, like 100%.
Yeah.
But there are also unintended consequences from letting CO2 concentrations get to 450 parts per million, right?
Yes.
Like in both cases.
Exactly.
So
it's a risk.
You've got to try to evaluate those relative unintended consequences. But I do want to go back. So you said it's unlikely that a rogue state or a rogue billionaire would initiate that, would initiate like the first sort of significant deployment. But why? So let's say you're India. We had Kim Stanley Robinson on our pod. Stranger than fiction. Like, what if India has 20 million people dying from a heat event and says, we're just going to do this ourselves?
Totally get it. So Kim Stanley Robinson did his homework. So it's not just fiction imitating science or science imitating fiction. Kim went to a bunch of meetings about solar geoengineering and heard people talk about India.
Yeah.
Or Stan, as he's called, not Kim. I don't know. I spent a week in India about exactly 1 year ago, where there were actually an amazing number of pretty senior people talking about this, some of whom were talking about deployment in ways where I'm not sure they knew what they were saying. I think, though, in a kind of purely rational sense, if you imagine yourself as a leader in India or Indonesia or somewhere like that, even if you're fundamentally self-interested, the real politic is you think about what other countries are going to do in response. And if choice A is to do it purely unilaterally, and choice B is to gather a few other countries and make a deal that you'll announce stuff together and do it, you're going to know that case B is going to be much more stable. And so you're going to be much more likely to do case B. And so that's where I think a purely unilateral action is not very likely.
Yeah, and there is recourse available to other state actors where, say, a state to move unilaterally.
So my sense is that to be a stable coalition, it needs to have some major players from the global south, because they're the ones most at risk. They're the ones who kind of have the moral authority to do stuff, and countries like India have the technical ability to do it. And then, hopefully some Western democracies, but who the heck knows? I mean, I think the biggest thing to say is, I'm talking like I know. I'm very involved in these conversations, but I have no idea what's going to happen politically. I don't think anybody does. I think there's some very overheated, overconfident claims about how solar geoengineering will play out. Right now, I can say opinions are changing quickly. The only thing I believe really strongly and with confidence is we ought to have a much more serious research program to know more, and we need better mechanisms of international assessment to kind of pull the science together so that people like me aren't the ones talking to you in a way, so that there's much more credible assessments like an IPCC special report or a bunch of different mechanisms that would provide better, credible answers that summarize the science.
And do we need a moratorium on deployment for the time being? Like with some sort of enforcement capabilities behind it?
Yes, I think we need some kind of soft moratorium. The problem with moratorium is what the exit conditions are. But yeah, Ted Parson, who I'm friendly with, and I proposed an early one 10 years ago or so. I think something where a bunch of countries essentially proclaim what they would do in the case of proclaim their resistance to unilateral action, and say something about what they do to block unilateral action, and say something about the conditions they need in terms of science and assessment to make decisions. I think a thing like that would be very helpful.
Okay. Just giving the audience a heads up, we'll turn to Q&A in probably about 3 minutes, and I think we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. So how do you know when to start? Like, you could say right now, with the warming that people have experienced, some of it's anecdotal, some of it, people are saying, hey, it's a warming world, and the World Meteorological Organization reported 1.45 C above pre-industrial. At what point do you say, we need to do this? We talked a bit about the how, like UN or consensus-driven or semi-consensus, but is it at 2 C above pre-industrial? Is it 2.5? Is it 3 C? Like, when do you flip the switch?
So I think the biggest thing to say is that there's we is too easy a word in climate, because we kind of implies that we can all agree. And the hard part, of course, is that there is no we. There's a whole bunch of individuals and some of them aren't born yet. And Oliver Morton from The Economist wrote one of the most thoughtful books on this topic called The Planet Remade. He has a very nice paragraph about how he avoided the use of the word we, because it applies this kind of easy assumption about agreement. So, there are now quite a lot of thoughtful people who think that we should have already started solar geoengineering, and I'm pretty close to that, but not quite there, but I have a few conditions. And there are people who really seem to believe we should never, ever do it under any circumstances. And I think for myself that the balance of evidence is that if you start it very slowly, the risks are really low, and you learn a lot and get some small benefit. So I think an important thing to say is, if you think about starting it as hitting a big red button and starting it so you suddenly try and cool the world, actually cooling the world down, I think that would almost certainly be a bad idea under basically any circumstance. But if you think starting means very incrementally beginning to add more sulfur to the stratosphere, inching up towards the background level of the stratosphere and monitoring as you go, where you're still in a factor of 10 or more below what a big volcano does, I think that is, by many measures objectively, in physical risk, a very low risk thing, and we learn a lot from it. And I basically would be in favor of such a thing. But I do think the key thing is to get some more trusted assessments really quickly, like years.
So last question to you, then we'll open it up to the audience. And I do a lot of work in carbon removal these days. I get this question all the time. Isn't this just the latest panacea, greatest panacea put forward by industry, specifically the oil and gas industry, to avoid actually reducing emissions? Now, I don't want to be clear. The oil and gas industry is not behind what you're talking about by the research. But how do you deal with that moral hazard question? Because some would look at it and say, great, problem solved.
So I think you got to partly deal with it head on. Realize there's absolutely part of that that's real, that you can, self-interest is a powerful motivator. So I expect that some people in big oil companies or fossil-influenced nations will seek to overclaim about solar geoengineering, say how it just does solve the problem and it really does mean we don't need to cut emissions. I think we should expect that to happen because that's how self-interest works. And I think those of us who believe we ought to cut emissions and eventually do carbon removal and maybe do solar geoengineering in the interim need to find how to address that head on. But we need to admit that push to moral hazard is real. I don't think there's any way to kind of magically legislate it away. I do think the research community can be clear that it's not associating itself with the fossil fuel industry, but I don't think that magically solves the problem. I think you can think about ways to couple together nations that have a vote in some future treaty or regime around solar geoengineering, so you get more of a vote if you're cutting emissions strongly. And particularly, actually, this colleague, Ted Parson, has thought a little bit about how that could actually work in a treaty, or we're not making treaties so much these days, but some kind of regime, international regime, could couple together strong emissions cuts and actions. There's no magic answer, but it's the right question.
That sounds a better preferential system than J.D. Vance giving extra votes to parents because they're, oh, and the vice presidential debate tonight. It'll be scintillating, great edutainment. Okay, thanks. Let's go to the audience. We have 14 minutes and 7 seconds for audience Q&A. And we've got two
microphones circulating, yep.
Yep. And sorry, so we get these on the pod, if you could just save your question till you get the mic and speak clearly into the mic.
Hey guys, thank you so much for introducing me to Kim Stanley Robinson. First off, I love Ministry for the Future, so it's awesome. And I feel like we're living in it at this very moment. But for Canada, we have an issue with permafrost melting. And when we speak often about geoengineering, we're talking about sometimes albedo, looking at the ground rather than the stratosphere, worrying about sulfur emissions into the atmosphere, and then having a big permafrost melt turning it all over as a big soup. So would you mind speaking a little bit about geoengineering with it having to do with albedo and ground?
Well, I mean, the way that we most know how to deal with albedo melt is sulfuric acid in the stratosphere. That's the thing that the only thing that there's really high confidence, even the IPCC says so, that you could do it. And it would reduce temperatures and it would reduce melt. And you can see that that's a significant contributor to uncertainty about future warming in lots of work, including work that Damien Matthews, a Canadian climate scientist, and I published a long time ago. Here's an interesting thing. People often think about the ways that the presence of the knowledge of solar geoengineering or the actual implementation of it might encourage humans to emit more. To be clear, that's this kind of moral hazard connection, but fundamentally, they're separate tracks. Emissions is its own problem. Emissions, no matter whether solar geoengineering is there or not, emissions hurts our grandkids. Emissions puts a risk on the future, period. And we need to push emissions down towards zero. Solar geoengineering has its own set of risks, but it's ultimately an independent thing. But in thinking about that connection, people often think that solar geoengineering does or doesn't directly do anything to carbon. Here's the thing to think about. If you imagine two worlds with exactly the same anthropogenic, industrial emissions of carbon, one world has significant solar geo and the other doesn't. So the world with solar geo has lower temperatures at the end of the century. In a world with lower temperatures, the carbon cycle feedbacks, including permafrost loss, but also the ocean ones, are lower. So a world with solar geoengineering, there's actually less carbon in the atmosphere at the end of the century than a world without it. And it's quite a bit less. Like, it's the equivalent, if you do quite a bit of solar geoengineering, of like eliminating US emissions for the century. So there is some carbon benefit to solar geo.
Thanks, and I do enjoy your podcast. I'm a regular subscriber. Thanks so much, guys. Great to see you in the flesh. But I have a conundrum. Well, first of all, my first conundrum is I'm 80 years old. Second conundrum is I've got a memory, and that memory is of pollution of the atmosphere with sulfur from coal-fired generating plants. I've also worked on coal-fired plants as well. That was a big problem. Sulfur-laden coal, especially in the eastern seaboard.
Yep.
Pollution of lakes, killing of fish, vegetation, getting into the ocean, and now we're talking about adding sulfuric acid into the atmosphere. Help me understand.
Totally get it. I think some numbers will really help. So absolutely get it. And because of all that history, which you just said, which I already mentioned, that's why we know so much about sulfur in the atmosphere. Completely agreed. But the numbers matter. At the peak of global industrial sulfur emissions in the 70s, emissions were over 100 million tons a year in sulfur. No, over 70. I'm mixing up SO2 and S units. Over 70 million tons a year in sulfur units, and they're now down well under 50. It's actually a little hard to get the exact number because of pollution controls driven by all the concerns you said. And what we're talking about doing, if you wanted to cool the Earth late in the century by, say, I think half a degree, which to me is more credible, maybe taking us down from, 2.5 to 2 or something like that, that would take, if you did it carefully, under 2 million tons a year. So it would be a few percent of what we were putting in before, and it's globally distributed, whereas at least for acid rain and also for air pollution, the concentration matters. Acid rain is very much a problem of local concentration. So we use all that same environmental science that was used to find out about both air pollution and acid rain and other impacts of sulfur, and we're applying all that, and we find that if you're putting a few million tons a year in the stratosphere, it does all come down, but it comes down evenly. You just don't see environmental problems that are very big. They're not zero. That's the number I told you before about additional mortality, but they're objectively pretty small compared to the benefits if we're doing the science right.
There's a paradoxical thing too, David, if you could just talk about it quickly, is that the current sulfuric acid emissions the world has, said it's 50 million tons now, it's actually providing a cooling effect.
Yes.
Like what would happen if we eliminated all those emissions today?
So if we eliminated all human greenhouse gas and air pollution emissions today, the world would, answer for yourself first, warm up or cool down in 10 years. The answer is the world would warm up, because right now we've got all the long-lived greenhouse gases are a warming thing, but they're partly masked by the aerosol cooling. And the aerosol cooling is short-lived, but if we instantly eliminated both, what you'd actually see is a little warming blip as you took away the cooling effect of aerosols. And so that gives you a sense that that again, this idea of human aerosol changing the climate is not news. I mean, why did it not warm up very much in the 60s and 70s, and then warming started in the 80s? Mostly because of aerosol pollution was masking the CO2-driven warming.
Got a question in the front here?
David and Ed, if you could inject something into the atmosphere that would in fact reduce the warming effect, how permanent is this likely to be? I mean, if we just shoot something up into the air today, is it going to last to tomorrow, next century? Is it just going to reduce the blip for a short period of time? What's the permanence?
The lifetime in the stratosphere of aerosols is about 2 years. And from my perspective, that's actually kind of that is just a fact, but it's kind of a good number in a sense that it means you can adjust the amount up and down, but it also means that if like the thing putting it in broke, it does not like the aerosols suddenly go out. You can have 6 months, you can fix it. So that, anyway, the answer is about 2 years. So you can ramp it up and ramp it down slowly in principle. And one thing that kind of gets at maybe that question in the last one, so you might say, why are we talking about the stratosphere, not the lower atmosphere? Because I kept talking about sulfur pollution in the lower atmosphere. Sulfur in the lower atmosphere lasts about a week, whereas sulfur in the upper atmosphere lasts about a year, so 50-to-1 ratio. And sulfur that comes down is rained out, so it's about 20 times less air pollution damage than local sulfur. And the combination of that 20 times 50 means that the ratio of cooling benefit to air pollution harm and measuring human mortality is 1,000-to-1. So putting a kilogram of sulfur in the stratosphere does 1,000 times more cooling per air pollution harm than does emitting sulfur with our current distribution of sulfur sources.
Can you contrast that lifetime with CO2? So let's say we get to net zero by 2050, and it's 450 parts per million, let's say. How long would it take through non-interventionist means, just through the natural carbon cycles, for that CO2 concentration to dissipate?
The short answer on policy-relevant timescale is forever. So the warming commitment, which isn't quite the same as the CO2 commitment, but the one that matters, is many thousands of years. So if we want a cooler planet, we got to take the CO2 out.
Yeah.
Study I read says a half-life of CO2 in the atmosphere is 43 years. And I'm not going to make it to 43 years, so you guys watch for it.
So that's actually false. There's several different lives. There's both geochemical equilibration with the deep ocean and there's surface equilibration. So there's both actually a shorter half-life. A bunch of the half-life is with the ocean mixed layer, which actually just goes in a year and a bit. And then there's this much longer time scale. There isn't a single exponential. We often fit it with 3 exponentials, one of which is around a 50-year exponential, and then there's a 300-year one. So that is just not what the science says.
I'd love to do a little instant poll, because David and I were talking on the way in just around Canada. Because Canada is pretty much, apart from great Canadian researchers, like, leading Canadian researchers like David and Ted Parsons, who are Canadians. And there's one other.
And one more. By a funny, weird coincidence, 3 of the authors who are probably the most cited on climate engineering all grew up in Ottawa at the same time, but we went to different high schools. So me and Doug McMartin and Ted, actually Ted's 10 years older, but we all grew up in Ottawa.
Yeah. Gosh, had you met then, had you started a band, you could.
It would have been a crappy band.
It would have been a
Actually,
crappy band.
Ted's a good musician. But.
Yeah. But so the poll, Canada is, as a federal government, MIA when it comes to any kind of serious research into solar geoengineering. And David and I, we had Jonathan Wilkinson as a minister on the show, and David put that question to him, and there could be an update there soon. As Canadians here, and you could just do this through a simple raising of hand, who would be supportive of the federal government spending money, and let's say it's on the order of single-digit millions, to join the global research effort into solar geoengineering? Would you be supportive of that? So I'm looking at it, and I think it's roughly 3/4 supportive.
Let's see the opposite. Let's see oppose it strongly.
Yeah.
Or oppose it. Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that's really interesting is there's this perception that there's this huge pushback against research, and there's some very articulate, impressive climate scientists like Rapier Humbert, who I really love, who just thinks that I'm just a terrible human and that we absolutely shouldn't do this research. And when I took the job at UChicago, where I used to live, he emailed people saying they'd sold out. So there are people like Ray, and Susan Solomon is one of the absolute greats who helped discover the ozone hole and really believes we shouldn't be doing it. But we did a poll like this. There was a point more than a decade ago in Europe where Ken Caldera and I were on stage for a European Geophysical Union meeting, actually a much bigger hall than this, and some BBC announcer was hosting it. There were a couple other people on stage, and he had a snap poll kind of like that. But this is in Europe, and more than 10 years ago on research on solar geo, he had 4 categories of strongly supportive and opposed. And I expected in front of Europe that almost everybody be opposed. No, almost everybody was in favor, even then 10 years ago, but somehow it just didn't happen.
Yeah, and so going back 10 years, it will be 10 years come this December when you and I collaborated in running that first workshop in Canada. This is 10 years ago when energy versus climate was a mere twinkle in our eyes. Maybe that collaboration was, an early ancestor to energy versus climate. And at the time, I had to pretty much beg and plead the heads of other environmental groups just to send, say, a junior analyst to show up for what was a day-long workshop. Didn't want to know, didn't want to think about it. And now we have Environmental Defense Fund, which is one of the largest environmental groups in the US, which has undertaken a major research program into it. We don't have the Canadian counterpart yet.
But I guess a question for you, Ed, actually turn the tables for a second. So yeah, Environmental Defense actually now has a real solar geoengineering research program. They'll raise $10 or $20 million, and they have a program of governance research, and they're actually to fund research. So my thinking is that might be the first penguin off the ice floe, and more NGOs will follow. But Ed, you're the NGO expert more than me. How important do you see that EDF decision to do this how much do you think it'll resonate?
Well, I think it was important, and it has turned out to be prescient, because in the paper, the white paper that we wrote following that workshop, we said one of the major signs of some degree of acceptance of at least having the conversation. And to be clear, the conversation was only about expanded research.
Yeah.
Only about that. One of the signs would be a major NGO undertaking a research program, starting a research program on it. Little did we know at the time that we would have to wait 10 years but here we are. So it is purely anecdotal, but based on the 75% of the hands that we saw go up, I think it's a very different conversation, a very different space today than it was 10 years ago. And I think part of that is that, and whether it's actually grounded in science or not, it could be anecdotal, but people are feeling like the world is warming and that things are getting dire. That's my anecdotal sense.
Well, thank you.
Thanks. We're out of time, folks. Enjoy the rest of Unite 2024.
Thanks for lending us your ears.